Stories of men who've seen a motherland they've dared to leave, a dream on the horizon to chase. A mother's hands that carefully weave a new life from her make-believe, a city with a hope and warm embrace. Islands to Liverpool, generations hand in hand across the sea. Homes where the heart is beating strong for all to hear. Welcome as we bring language, dance and songs to sing, to celebrate a fondness of our past. The future is for us to hold and cherish all the stories told, each chapter penned a longing to surpass. Ireland to Liverpool, generations hand in hand across the sea. Homes where the heart is beating strong for all to hear. Generations hand in hand across the sea. Homes where the heart is beating strong for all to hear. Ireland to Liverpool, generations hand in hand across the sea. Homes where the heart is beating strong for all to hear.
Clara, before we get into all the details of creating the performances, I hear a beautiful Northern Irish accent. Can I be incredibly cheeky Irish and ask you where you're from?
Yes, I'm from Belfast.
I love Belfast.
I'm from just outside Belfast, a little town called Hollywood.
I
Classic.
know it well. I went to college in Queens.
Okay.
Yeah, I did my drama degree in Queens, and listen, best few years of my life, I have to say.
It is a great city. We do love it here. But I've loved down south. I'd love to visit more. My brother actually just did a little road trip around Ireland. I was very jealous. I'd love to go see more of it. I've been to Galway a couple of times, but I would love to see more. I think the southern accent's much nicer than mine as well. That's just a classic thing, isn't it? But yeah.
Always the grass is greener. I always found it so funny when I moved to the north how people referred to us as being from the south.
Yes.
I grew up in Dublin and Galway, grew up in both. And so in Dublin, they would have called me a Caillte, being from the west. And in Galway, I was called a Dublin Jackeen, but I was never from the south. I was from the east or the west. And so it was interesting getting into the mindset that because of partition, there's the north and the south.
Yeah,
and you know, people shouting the word Mexican at you. It was
probably not anymore.
It was 2001 when I moved there, so it was post Good Friday, and we had the warmest welcome and just such a wonderful experience. But there wasn't a lot of dance, and so I was interested when I saw your work and like how technically proficient and how sophisticated your dance practice was. I wouldn't have encountered that much dance on the island of Ireland in terms of professional training. Is that why you moved to Liverpool?
I started as an Irish dancer here. I think that's mainly what most young dancers start as, just because it's the most available. I loved Irish dancing. I was a festival Irish dancer, so there's two slightly different strains, and I loved it, and I'm still involved in it. But when it came to the point that I wanted to be a professional dancer, I knew I wanted to go professionally. Most of the places do seem to be in England. I know that there's more that are opening here, and it's becoming a much more sort of accepted thing here. I think there's arts in general, in Northern Ireland in particular, is quite a small community, and I'd love it to get bigger. But yeah, it's hard here to find the training to get to the level that you want to be if you want to be a professional dancer. I know in Dublin there's some lovely courses, amazing things. I auditioned also in Limerick for their Irish music and dance course, which I loved. But yeah, I felt that I could get the best training in Liverpool. But yeah, a lot of contemporary dance now here, which I've loved. Being at home because of COVID, it's actually been really great because I've got to experience more of a community here that I didn't know really existed, and find lots of really interesting artists that I think need to like come to the forefront a bit more. And contemporary dance is becoming a much bigger thing here, which I'm so pleased about. I hope it continues to grow. But yeah, as you said, it's still a lot of people tend to go over to England to get to train, which is a shame. Hopefully something will come here that can facilitate Northern Irish dancers, but most people stick to Irish dancing, I find. I don't know.
I would see it as a way in. Now, I mean, I was in school in the 80s and 90s, so the Irish dancing we were taught was not like the river dance fun where you could move your arms. So I didn't progress very far with it, should we say. But I think it's interesting in terms of performance and in terms of starting to look at an emergence of feminist Irish performance that's very much focused on the body. Because when you look at histories of 20th century Irish theatre, they're very powerful. They're very powerful at dealing with certain aspects of post-colonialism or dealing with the violence in the north. But they're very much state of the nation plays, sitting around the kitchen table plays, language led plays, and looking at this kind of these tensions between Irishness and Britishness and Northern Irishness, and the past and the present. What I'm seeing increasingly in the last 20 years is a real blossoming of feminist, women-led collaborative work And I'm not saying that didn't exist in the 20th century, but I'm seeing a real blossoming, and I'm seeing a very confident, politicized blossoming of it, which looks at the body having its own language and being able to express things about the past and the present that are very complicated, perhaps with greater fluidity. And I'd love to hear how you moved from your Irish dancing, which is very codified in many ways, to the type of performance we've seen you create about tune.
Yeah.
How the body worked there.
Yeah. It is a hard transition. I think for me, I loved dance in its full form from a very young age. I was very lucky that I had parents that took me to see dance a lot. I saw a lot of different things. So I was very fortunate that I was exposed to that at a young age. So I knew that other things existed outside Irish dancing. I think that's quite important. I think sometimes you don't have the opportunity to see that there's more to it than just your legs and your feet, which is it's a normal thing. But when I went to Liverpool, I think I had already watched a lot and I knew how I could move, but it became, like you said, like I sort of became my body in a way. That's the whole connection, I think, when you're training as a dancer, like finding the connection with soul and body, how you move, and fine-tuning your body so that you can move the way you want to move, which is why it's like constant work, because you never fully perfect that, but it's like finding that. And I found that mainly in my third year when I was starting to look at the mother and baby homes and starting to find my choreographic voice as well, because I found how I like to move and how that was my own identity. It takes a lot of time. I'm still finding it, like it's still a massive, like, I don't know, it takes a lot of time to find it and find your voice and find the progression. I'm sure you probably do this too, when you have moments when you really find it and you're like on this high and you've got your voice, and then you sort of lose that a little bit as other things happen and it comes back. But yeah, in Liverpool, it was more about having that arc of all the other training, like in contemporary and jazz and tap and all these different things that I'd never done before, that then I can bring it into one person to find like how I move. But it is a journey. I'm still finding it, but it's really interesting, like the whole, how your body then takes all that in. I think with Caillte, with the show, that was sort of like my final, like, this is who I was, even though I wasn't dancing in it. It felt like a real point of how I moved my identity. And I think that's why I felt so emotional when I watched it. I could never really watch it fully because I just felt so emotional, like it was my whole identity, even though it wasn't about me. It just is such a personal thing. I don't know, did you feel that when you created Unveiled? Like, did it feel like it was a big part of your identity, or did you feel separate from it in terms of?
No, I felt very much connected to it. I don't know that I'm even confident yet of how I felt about it. I feel like I've maybe just exited a relationship and I can't even see it properly. And I don't know that I've even exited yet. I think looking at your work, which I knew nothing about previous to seeing it, and you're a bit younger than me, we'll say. You're from the north and I'm from the south, as we've established. And yet there is so many links about womanhood and Irishness and the past and the present. And it's becoming clear to me that on some level, there is an instinct or an impulse to express a history that we only partially know, but also to understand history as not something that is concluded. This isn't a narrative that is finished, where we can say, well, we've reached the end now, and this is what has been resolved. Very little has been resolved. And we will only ever partially know the history because a lot of the women who were sent to these institutions have died. So we can't get their first-hand accounts. So we've some accounts from some people. We've some accounts from children who were sent to the institutions. We've some wider community memories. But, you know, these are all emerging at a time where with these people, most of their life, they've been encouraged not to talk about it. Yeah. Because it would, you know, it was so caught up with a prevailing climate of shame and secrecy. And then for our generation, if I can be so bold as to include us in the same one, it's like, no, this didn't happen to me. I was never sent to one of these institutions. There was never the threat that I was going to be, or is going to be punished in that very explicit way. And yet, you know, you're not that far past it. And when you start digging, you find out about the neighbor or the second cousin or your friend's aunt, and you realize there are connections.
Yeah.
And you don't know really what to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
So my mum is from Tuam, and she would have been fostered by her aunt and uncle in Tuam. Her own parents couldn't take care of her. But she was legitimate, as it was called then. She was in school with what she called the home babies. And then when I was 9, we moved from Dublin to Tuam.
Okay.
And stayed there till I finished my leaving cert. It was in 2001. And then I left for university, and my mum moved back to Dublin. So it was kind of in and out. But the whole time I was there, I never once heard about the institution.
Wow.
And it was when Catherine Corless broke the news and it became this international whirlwind that I went back and asked my mum, but she really didn't like to talk about it. She just said they were encouraged not to talk to them at school. And she said one day she was in the playground and one of the home babies was on a swing and she wanted to go on the swing. So she pushed the other child off it. And she said that was perfectly fine. And that was the kind of climate the nuns had created, and you were allowed to do that. But her aunt, who had fostered her, was walking home through the park at the time and she saw my mother do it. She took her home and she said she gave her the greatest clatter and said, if you ever treat another child like that again. And so mum realized it was wrong, but she didn't know what was wrong because she was allowed to do it at school. You know, and so I'm finding this out as I'm going.
Yeah.
And of course the building itself is knocked down, so I wouldn't have passed by it on the street. It would be up the Dublin road, so you know it was a populated area, but it wouldn't have been the centre of town.
Yeah.
And now it's made way for a housing estate. So there was no real reason to pass it. You weren't going to see it. It wasn't beside a big shopping centre or anything. And so the remnants of the history are very, very fragmented. And then a lot of the women, when they left, as well as suppressing the experience because it must have been so difficult for them, were also encouraged or forced sometimes to leave because there was the remaining stigma in their community that they had brought shame on their family and their community. So much of this experience and this history is really unknown and really scattered. And what I'm seeing by people like yourself, by the students I worked with, and I should really say Nuachtaithe was co-created by a group of incredible young students. It wasn't me by myself with the plan, it was devised by us together, is a lot of women-led and feminist-led theatre artists, performers, performance artists, wanting to look at this, wanting to reckon with it, and feeling that it is kind of the legacy that's left and that our generation should be dealing with it where possible, you know, sensitively, responsibly, you know, looking at all the sources we have, but that, you know, you can't look away from it. You have to look at it. And perhaps we're at the start of that journey. So that's how I came across it. I'd be interested in hearing, when did you first hear about the institution and what did you know about institutional history in Ireland more widely?
I had no idea. And I think that's why I found it so shocking. I'd heard about the mills and things before, but like on a very sort of casual, like this happened as part of history kind of thing, and not in any detail. And then it must have been summer of 2018, I think, I was in the kitchen with my mom and she was listening to BBC Radio 4 and Home Babies by Becky Milligan was on, and she had done this, I don't know if you're familiar with it, she'd done a series in Tuam talking to residents there about their experience, if they had any memories like you said with your mum, that's those sort of stories, and she was sort of trying to piece it together. And as soon as I heard it, I was so shocked, like I was horrified, and I remember just felt really touched by it. I couldn't forget about it. I couldn't forget what I was hearing, so I went on and listened to the whole thing, and my initial thought was this would make an incredible dance piece, which is weird, horrible, and quite a weird thing to think about, but that's how my brain functioned, because it was the only way I could kind of process, the only way I could think about how I would actually express how I felt about the whole thing. And like you said, from a feminist point of view as well, I thought it was so important. The children that were in there and their experience was awful, and the suffering was just, you can't even begin to really function and think about it. But I felt like the female story, the women that went in there and that journey that they experienced hadn't really been talked about enough. And I was saying to you this morning about the survivors, that amazing that you got stories from them, because when I was looking at it, I couldn't find a single story about a woman that had gone through it. And I don't know if I think women have come forward since, but I couldn't find a single person that actually told their story from going in there and the trauma, and then coming back out and that going back into the community. And so from knowing nothing to then sort of diving in and trying to find out how that would have been, because that was what I found most interesting. And that whole female body, that power that we have over that now, and luckily we all are able to make those decisions for ourselves now, but at the time as well, we didn't have that choice. And I felt it was very important to say how that power is still not in our hands. And I felt that was a really important story. And then I went to train. I actually went to train with my parents again, and I know exactly what you mean when it's not there. The only reason we could find the site was because we had listened to the podcast, and she was like, it's off the Dublin Road and you go this way and that way, and no sign of anything really. It was as if it had been erased from history really at that point. And so we sort of had a walk around and eventually found it. And I just remember it being very cold and grey, and I don't know if that actually was, but it felt like that. And I tried to imagine that feeling of walking in and embarking on that journey. And so that's how I sort of started to learn about the institutions and things. But up to that point, I had really no history of looking at it. When you embarked on it with your students, had they heard about it? Did they have any idea about the institutions before they started?
A little, like since the 90s, the news, the 6 o'clock news in Ireland has generally every year, every couple of years, is bombarded with some scandal about institutionalization. So Mary Raftery, who's now passed away, she was an amazing Irish journalist, and she, I think, primarily uncovered the grave at the Magdalen Laundry in Drumcondra High Park, where there was remains of women, and I believe children, and they couldn't all be identified. And that led to the opening of some scandals. There was also a lot of work done about survivors from industrial schools and orphanages. And there was reports such as the Ryan report, the Cloyne report. Then we had the report into the Magdalen Laundries, which I think was published 2013, the McAleese report. It wasn't well received. It seemed to be quite limited in its scope and what it could do. And it said there was no evidence of abuse in the Magdalen Laundries. Wow. Interesting finding. And so one by one, Jim Smith, he's a US sort of scholar who's led the field in terms of Magdalen Laundry research, talks about an architecture of containment, that we have this complex web of institutionalization, and each of the institutions are quite different, but they're very much related. They're about managing the population at a time when Ireland suffers from enormous poverty, and Ireland is very conservative and controlled by a very small cohort of powerful interests. And so that's one starting point for getting into it. So I would say, the culture of this constant reports and commissions and investigations into institutional history has been on the news so often. It's sort of in the ether, like you would be aware of it. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, the students I worked with, they were in their third year, they're 19, 20 years old. They didn't know that much. They knew some bits, and they absolutely immersed themselves in it. And like you, when they read the testimonies and read information about it, it wasn't that they were excited to make a piece of art about it, more that they felt compelled to respond. Absolutely compelled. And language, you just kind of feel really frustrated because you're trying to say what you feel or what you think or what you want to do, and sometimes the words aren't there. And so movement really did become a leading aspect. And I wouldn't be a dancer. I've no dance background other than the Irish dancing under duress when I was 7 at school, you know, that I wouldn't. Some of the students did have backgrounds in dance. Some of them didn't. Some of them are studying law. It was an optional module. Some of them are studying history, and they chose to do this. So really socially aware students who are political and motivated. But because we were rehearsing during COVID, this I found particularly interesting and very helpful, actually. A lot of them weren't living in student accommodation. Student accommodation is often a bit crowded. It was deemed too transmissible. And we were at our surge in COVID in February when we were doing rehearsals. We were in a level 5 lockdown. So the first month of rehearsals, or the first 5 weeks, we were online. So they were living at home with their families. And the 2 historians who lead the project that Nuachtatha became part of, it's Dr. Sarah Ann Buckley and Dr. John Cunningham, it's the Tuam Oral History Project, they're getting the testimonies from the survivors of the institution, but the survivors who are the children. So a lot of the women have passed away, and we don't have first-hand accounts from them, but we have memories from the children, and in some instances the children later met their birth mothers and were able to get an account. But it's fractured, you know, it's not as comprehensive perhaps as we would like in some ways, but it's still a huge intervention, should we say, into Irish history and capturing Irish history. And so the students were at home, and most of the students were from Galway and Mayo. We had one American student here doing a postgrad, one student was from Donegal, one student was from Kilkenny, but about 9 were from Galway and Mayo. And of the commission into the Tuam institution, or into the mother and baby institutions, reports that in Tuam, the majority of women were from Galway and Mayo. Now, we're not a heavily populated region. So these students were going home and talking to their parents and saying, this is what I learned today from reading this testimony. And these testimonies hadn't been released online. So, you know, they were getting them before the wider public with the permission of the survivors. Everything was done in consultation and with their explicit approval. And so then they were getting the stories, you know, and this could be a topic that perhaps had not been broached in their homes before. In one scene, one student, you know, was on the phone to her grandmother quite a bit and saying, you're kidding me, right? But getting more information from the grandmother's perspective, who lived through a lot of this time. So they created these pieces informed by the memories of children who are now quite elderly, 70s and 80s, informed by wider sort of political reports and historical documents regarding institutionalization. And then the bit that I wasn't prepared for, which was probably led by COVID and the conditions of COVID, was actually going home every night or staying at home after rehearsals, which were online, and saying, you know, this is what we looked at today and I can't believe this happened. And then the parents adding in, and then the parents, you know, provoking memories of the wider family. And that became really interesting. But yeah, it felt a bit spooky at times that the majority of students who chose this module, which was optional, were from Galway and Mayo, and the majority of women sent to the Tuam institution were from Galway and Mayo. And so it feel like there was some communication there that I can't really explain without sounding a bit mad.
No, absolutely, yeah.
We all felt connected to it and we cared about it a lot. And yeah, I mean, it's deeply upsetting reading those testimonies. So we had to go through them very carefully and take breaks. And I just encouraged them, you know, at the end of rehearsals to watch a lot of trash on TV and, you know, zone out. You know, you have to allow a space in your mind where you can switch off if you want to be able to switch back on.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very interesting that the older generation, older being just
Careful.
anyone, even just my parents, when I first started to look into it, it's not that there's a sort of, I don't want to say there's an ignorance to it, because it's not at all. They're not ignorant. That's really horrible. But there's just like almost an acceptance of that was what happened, and not in a way that it shouldn't be talked about or that it shouldn't change. But it felt like a very Irish thing that you just ignore it. it's happening, but we just ignore it, and it's there, but we don't associate ourselves with that. And that I found really difficult, because in this day and age now, you know, we all stand up for what we believe in, hopefully, and you'd like to think if something like that was happening now, it would never happen, because people would say, what is going on? This isn't right. We need to change this. And so I found that really difficult, that there was so much sort of powers that be saying that this was happening, this is how it goes, that people didn't have that opportunity to say they didn't feel comfortable, or maybe they didn't feel uncomfortable. I don't know. That's the crazy thing, that it wasn't an uncomfortable thing for people, and I find that really difficult.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the work by historians there, and different historians take different positions, but one perspective that I have heard argued quite frequently in Ireland is that these institutions were systems of social control. And so if someone tries to say, as some people have, oh, the family sent them there, you know, it's not the fault of the church, it's not the fault of the state, it was the families who put them there. And actually, the sense of how power and punishment operated in that society, you had no choice. You had very little choice but to put your daughter in one of these institutions if she became pregnant. And that pregnancy may have occurred as a result of a consensual, loving relationship. It may have occurred as a result of violence, but there was very little choice. And these were the days before the internet, before you could emigrate for a while out of choice and then come back and get a job if you wish to. You know, if you emigrated, it was likely forever. You know, there was no internet, there was no chatting on FaceTime, there was no Facebook. You might never see that family member again. So if you lived in this society, you had to obey by these rules. There was nowhere to go. There wasn't freedom to move or to travel in the way that we experience it. You know, most people didn't have cars. Most people didn't have secondary school education. You know, it was a society ravaged by poverty and by a very recent history of incredible violence that went on for hundreds of years. There was not a social confidence there to challenge authority. You've gone through hundreds of years of literally masters telling you how to live and having very little rights. So of course, when the powers that be say this is how it works, it's just not that simple as saying, well, I think that's wrong, and I'm not going to send my daughter into this institution. If then the rest of your family is going to be punished as a result, if that child is going to be punished, you know, if you don't have the education and the economic stability to challenge forces in power, really, what can you say? Like, people are just trying to survive. And I think that's the tragedy of the situation, you know, that people felt like they had no choice. I've never heard of anyone say that they think these institutions were a good idea.
Yeah.
You know, no, I don't see anyone defending them. I see a hesitancy about redress and about how the official record is captured. But I don't hear anyone saying, actually, these were great institutions that, you know, really helped Irish society. I don't hear that from anyone. So it's very much, there's an understanding that Irish society was in bits, you know, at the start of the 20th century. And these institutions were enabled to grow because of that level of precarity, you know, in terms of towns and villages and communities. And so I understand why people struggle to talk about it, because of course, if you were alive at that time and you're looking back and you're kind of going, God, maybe we could have challenged it more. Could they really have? I mean, if I was alive at that time, would I have challenged it? I mean, who knows? Like, if there's an overwhelming cultural and political and social context telling you this is how things are, and you don't see any other options.
Yeah.
It's
there
very
was no option, was there? Yeah. That's what makes it so sad. There was no option for people, that they just had to do it. And it's that choice again, like if we're going back to the female body, just not having that choice for years and years and years, only till recently, really. So I just, that was sort of the big emotional journey for me, was not having the choice.
Yeah.
I'm so glad that's changed finally, but it's just so interesting that so many women had to go through that, and still I just feel so sorry for them that they can't let their story be out in the open still, and that they didn't even maybe just didn't have the chance to.
I know, but I really appreciate seeing the absolute celebration of female rage. So in the past couple of decades, like all that anger, and I don't mean like in a crazy patriarchal stereotype of the angry woman who can't control her emotions, but like a type of rage that is very much rational and proportionate to the experiences and histories of women. And I'm seeing it be very generative in a positive way. Women really getting to grips with what solidarity is, what political activism is, what you can do for each other when you realize these are conditions we're facing because we are women. And that's why, like, that's a reason, but very much a reason. And finding those connections within your own community, but also abroad and internationally. And feminisms really being, you know, a transnational and an international network. And I found it so healthy seeing these stories come out, and sometimes they come out as official history, sometimes they come out as legal challenges to constitutional legacies, sometimes they come out through art, and very often art can precede, you know, the more dominant public space taking account of difficult histories. And so I've really enjoyed female rage, and seeing it blossom and prosper and change the very actualities in which we live and bring us together. Like the fact that we're even having this conversation now, you know, I'm very much an angry Irish woman, you know, in a way that I think is completely healthy and that I use to become involved in my world, and that makes me feel hopeful about the future. You know, and so I fully applaud, you know, the angry Irish woman all over the world, you know.
Absolutely, I know. I think I also, when I started even the rehearsal period, I found it very interesting, especially because I was in England at the time, sort of how little everyone knew. Even, I mean, I admit I didn't know very much to start with, but as I started to sort of delve into it, how little people, especially in England, knew about the institutions. And I really had to sort of sit everyone down and explain everything. And it was a really difficult thing to explain. Again, the same sort of thing about, you know, it wasn't a choice, this is what happened. And trying to explain that trauma, especially for dancers, often they need to know the full story in order to actually embody it. And at the time when we did the show in June, my friend Michaela was the lead female, and I know she found it really difficult, and I would too, because you're taking all of that on yourself. Like you're really taking in all of what she felt at the time. And I know after each show she was just like gone for the night. She was just like, I can't do anymore, because you give everything. And she really, really felt very strongly how well, what she thought and what we hoped was a good representation of how a woman would feel going through that. But it was quite angering. If I'm also, I don't know if I'm an angry Irish woman. I think I don't really feel like I have a full right to be an angry Irish woman, because I've grown up in such a different Ireland, a different Northern Ireland, and I don't know. I do obviously I have the right to be. I'm angry about the history. I'm angry about lots of different things, but I didn't feel like I had much of a right in England, because I felt like I had to be the person to explain and be the person to sort of rationalize things for people. I don't know, it's a whole thing, isn't it? The whole identity thing as well. That's a whole separate conversation. But that also, so I felt it was really important, especially for an English audience, to give across what I could about Irish culture at the time, and how this wasn't a choice, and that journey that the women would have gone through at the time. Because people really had no idea about a mother and baby home, like really didn't have any sort of background, which was difficult, but I also think good, because it gave a bit of education. I hope that if we happen to do it again, it's more of an education for people to understand and see what happened without maybe having to read about it or listen. Or, you know, dance can sometimes be a little more approachable because you go to a theatre and it's, you know, you can take it as it is. Maybe you don't feel anything afterwards, or maybe then afterwards you go and read Catherine Corless, or you go and you read different things, and just to give people a chance to have a look at the history and understand it more, understand what needs to be done. I think that's very important. Yeah, there's so much to do.
You're infiltrating the cultural consciousness through creating pieces like this. And that's so important because it allows a wider audience to engage in different levels. You can engage at a really intense level, or you can see it as a piece of art about someone else's history. But anything that opens it up as a site of dialogue, of intergenerational dialogue, of cross-community dialogue, that's wonderful. And it doesn't lessen the artistic value of it either. You know, it shows you what art is doing and how it connects us as human beings. And that's something that's gone on since the dawn of time. I think it's wonderful that you managed to do that with perhaps, I mean, the community of artists or dancers or performers you worked with, are these Irish people as well? Do they have any links to Ireland? Or have you essentially opened this up to a completely non-Irish community? Which is a really brave thing to do.
Completely non-Irish, as far as I know. Everyone there was either English or international. So no one, I was sort of the Irish person in the room and in the whole of the dance department in Liverpool, which was really interesting. I still, to this day, am the only Northern Irish or Irish person that was in the dance department. I have a bit of a reputation. But it's changing this year, which is very exciting. There's, I think, 3 students from Northern Ireland going there, which is great. But yeah, I was the only Northern Irish person or Irish person there. So I did feel a sense of responsibility. And I think had I not heard this story, I would have still loved to produce a show in my final year because I was sort of building up to that. But I think having a specifically Irish tale was something I really wanted. I really wanted to give that to people as sort of a mark of who I was and part of my identity and what I was finding when I was in Liverpool. Because when you're away from your community, when you're away from Ireland, you become so much more connected. That's what I find. I think that happens quite often with people. As soon as you go away and you're desperate to go away, and then you go away and all you want to do is come home, and you feel like a very strong sense of identity. And I think that really happened to me in Liverpool, and I felt this strong sense that this needed to be said, and it needed to be said with these people that didn't know very much about it. I was also very lucky that they were beautiful dancers and my friends, and we had an amazing time doing it, so that was also part of it. But yeah, I was the only Northern Irish or Irish person there, which was quite interesting. So well, they kind of really questioned it.
Aren't you a wonderful cultural ambassador for the island of Ireland? And I mean, isn't that so amazing what you've achieved? And I think, you know, we talk about a lot of the difficult histories and problems Ireland has had to face. There's something we can do on the island of Ireland that a lot of physical land masses can't do anymore. We can still have a national conversation because we're small and because our sense of history and culture and identity is so strong. Strong doesn't mean agreed upon. We all know, no, it's not. But we can still talk to each other as a nation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very few places can do that. That's an enormous privilege. That gives us enormous power and hope in terms of what we can achieve. And we've seen that. Like, look at the 2018 repeal referendum, look at the 2015 marriage referendum, look at everything that's happening with the North. As difficult as it is, we're all listening and watching and talking about it every day. That's hugely important, you know, in keeping us connected, in challenging systems we don't agree with, and making change happen. That makes me feel quite energized about the type of society we live in. I think it's great that you're doing your work, you know, abroad, if I can be as cheeky to say you're abroad and not home, and that's me taking liberties, assuming you'll come home. But maybe what we can do from this is figure out a way how to get your production to Galway. You know, maybe we have lots of space here in NUI Galway. Maybe we can look at infrastructure and planning. I mean, I would love to see your production occur.
I would love to do it. Absolutely.
So it's just a matter of filling out forms and keeping, you know, applying things in a really obnoxious way till someone gives in to you, and, you know, that's my experience, you know, eventually it's easier to give in to you, you know, it's the only way to get away from you. So there's still great ways we can communicate, and I would say enjoy every moment of these experiences in all these different countries. It sounds, when I talk to you, that you're someone who will eventually make your way back to the little island, but when you're ready, when you have stocked up enough on what the rest of the world has to offer as well, so that you can always be involved in conversations with other communities. Nationhood is important, but it is a concept. It is something we've created, whereas people are real.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a really important thing.
There's huge connection, huge, always will be. I love Ireland. I always have loved it. I just think it's one of those things, like we said, sort of going away and getting more perspective and coming back and forth. But I'll always be back and forth to here for sure. I don't think it'll ever leave me. I feel like that's quite a Northern Irish thing as well. Like that, it feels like there's a very big sense of it's part of who we are. I don't know if that's just me. I really feel like it's part of who I am. And when you go away as well with the accent and all those things, it's a sense of identity. I felt like that in Liverpool especially, and Liverpoolians are the same. They have a real sense of identity with their accent and where they're from, and I really love that. I think it adds a lot to who I am as an artist as well, I think. And it sort of always bubbles up every time I try and do something different. It's like, but wait, you could do this, or why don't you put a bit of Irish dancing in there, or use an Irish tune? You know, it always comes back to me, which I love. And the other thing I really wanted to ask you about was the spoken word that you had, and you had the interviews or the podcast with the survivors. Did that start the movement, or did you do the movement and then add that on top? Like, how did that connect together?
Is this the piece towards the end?
Yes, the three groups.
And the moving kind of body shots. So I can't take any credit for that. Okay. That was led by one of the students involved, Ikenna. He's just kind of brilliant. You know, he comes in with an idea and you can't even give feedback. You're like, just go do that, right? And he wrote that himself. So he took part in the classes, the workshops, and then he said, oh, look, I've something to show you. And I didn't really pay him any attention. I said, oh yeah, press play there, you know. And it was this completely polished, produced, ready to go spoken word piece that he wrote himself and produced himself, all at home in his bedroom.
Wow, it was beautiful. I loved it. I thought it was beautiful because I had some spoken word in mine, and I feel like it elevates everything to this next level, having the words with it, and I thought it was gorgeous. I loved it.
Just even the movement pieces, he had the idea. He said he wanted to do body shots. Again, I wasn't fully sure what he was talking about, but I said, grand. So when we had permission to come into campus, very quick rehearsal. He talked to some of the other students in his class about what he wanted. They were up for it. I mean, the students were amazing.
Yeah.
You know, like what we did really was set the scene. They had talks with the historians, Dr. Sarah Ann Buckley, Dr. John Cunningham, with the archivist, Dr. Barry Houlihan. So they had the specifics, they had the nuances of tune, because there's mother and baby institutions throughout Ireland, then there's institutional histories, but they had the very specifics on tune. We had meetings with the Tume Home Alliance where we talked them through their ideas and they gave us feedback. And I would also just highlight that when we had the first cut of the film produced, or the filmed performance, they saw it at home privately, and then they had time to reflect on it. And if they wanted to give feedback, or if they wanted to say, we don't like it, please don't show this, that was all built in. It's a survivor-led project, and we would not release anything online without their explicit approval, because the point of doing it is to amplify their voices. So they had all that frameworks. We studied a lot about Ireland in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, very little of it good. Made you really grateful to be born the time you're born in, to some extent. But then in terms of the individual performance projects, all those students in all those scenes created those themselves. So I gave them feedback, but I didn't come up with that. That's their individual work. And then we just talked, you know, at the end of a day's work about how it would connect together, how one piece might feed into a next piece. I worked very specifically on the opening movement piece, and on the interviews, and on like the dramaturgical thread to connect them all. But the individual pieces were created, written, directed, conceived of, performed, produced, edited by the students themselves. You know, they did a tremendous job. One thing that really interests me is that even though the testimonies they read, which we were responding to, our core stimuli, we'd start off reading a testimony and then physically respond, or respond in some way artistically to it, were all from the children who are in the home, who are now quite elderly. The initial instinct was always the woman who was sent to the institution. But we have no testimonies of the women sent to the institution. And so I had to keep saying, where are you getting this from? What you read is from the child who is now an adult, not from the child's mother. And I just thought that was kind of spooky.
Yeah, it is so interesting that that's always what it feels that it comes back to, is the woman. Did they say where that came from for them?
No, I think, I think maybe they felt a bit under pressure when I said, you didn't get that from a testimony because those women have passed on. And I think they were very nervous about any sense of trying to appropriate someone else's history or exploit it or misrepresent it. It's just so serious and so sensitive. You really have to be careful, and they understood that. So I think there was a bit of pressure in a sense of, can we do a good enough job for this group? But I think on reflection, of course, they went back to the women. It starts with how women are treated, how women's bodies are controlled, how women are published, how punished, how women are made symbolic of the state and its purity and its representation, and how womanhood becomes controlled by patriarchal interests, by religious interests, by capital interests, and that's ongoing today. Like, look at how women are treated on social media. Look at how the idea and the image of women is exploited by capitalist and business interests. So the control of women, the absolute domination of their image for other interests, that hasn't changed. It's just the forces involved in it have changed. And so of course they connect with it. They know as a woman, if you're perceived to have stepped out of line, you will be punished, and you will be punished in a different way to men most of the time in most countries. And unfortunately in 2021, I would argue that is still the case, but I am hopeful about it.
Yes, I also think it's very interesting that even with that stimulus, a lot of them went to movement. If that's not what their first skill is, that's very interesting to me, because it's just an embodiment of, like you said before, about you need to say something, sometimes the words don't come, and that movement. And I thought it was so beautiful, and it was so simple, but it said so much. It was gorgeous with the cots and the blankets and things. I just thought that was so beautiful. And then the one girl at the front who sort of broke out and did her own thing all of a sudden, I was just like, I find it so hard to describe dance because I just like feel it, but I thought it was just so beautifully done, and it's very interesting now. I love to watch it again, knowing that isn't their first skill, and thinking about how they had to move. I love that thought that we have to move to express, and because that's how I felt when we did culture, that was the only way I could express what we were doing. And I was the same really with the dancers that I did it with. A lot of them are close friends, and we did it collaboratively a lot. It's slightly different when it's sort of a choreographer and a dancer, because it is mainly that you have to give the idea in order to create with them. But often we did it together, and Michaela especially, who was our lead, we spent a lot of time together working through what it would feel like, where in the body we'd feel things. And I remember when we got to the scene when I wanted it to be a birth scene, but I didn't want her to give birth because obviously I haven't given birth yet and she hasn't either. I didn't feel like we could do that properly and in a sensitive way. So we decided to focus on the breath. And I remember reading, I think I remember reading this, that one of the things in the homes was that they didn't let them make much noise when they were giving birth as part of, so it was one of those things I thought, well, breath would have been such a big thing at that moment in your life when you can't make that noise. And that was so difficult for me to read. I remember thinking, how is that control? And so we did this whole thing about breath and breathing and the difference that you feel, and how it would get bigger and smaller and where, and different parts of your body. And that became one of my favorite pieces, even though, I mean, a lot of people probably watched it and didn't really know exactly what was going on. And then some mothers actually came up to me afterwards and said, I don't know how you knew exactly what birth feels like. And I was like, I don't, but that's really interesting, that breath and that sort of embodiment of how we think it would feel, and how we were trying to portray it. But it's very interesting that the movement is the first thing that people feel like they can do to communicate. I love that. That's exactly why I do it.
Well, let me advise you as someone who has had a child. Epidural. Like, don't scream as much as you want and scream the word epidural. I want to share about that experience.
I know. Yeah. That was a major thing with the homes that I read that really stuck with me. That's just one of the worst things that someone could possibly ask you to do, I thought.
Yeah, and I believe there wasn't, and really the historians and the legal scholars are the people best placed to discuss this in more detail. But from what I've read, in mother and baby institutions and Magdalene laundries, but in institutions, if you're having your baby, there were cases where people would be denied pain relief because it was your punishment for being pregnant outside of wedlock.
Mind-blowing, really, isn't it?
You know, and then to think that those women stayed in the mother and baby institution for maybe a year with the baby, and then the baby's taken away.
Yeah.
If someone took my child off me, even though there are days when I want to throttle her, you know, the level of human rights abuse and torture here is mind-blowing.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's terrifying. You almost can't think about it too much because it becomes like your own trauma. And that's why the art is so important, I feel, to let that go and to let sort of share it with people in a way, share it so that we're not taking it ourselves.
You manage your engagement with it, and I think the best way I found to think about it was actually what one of the students said once: we can't change it, but we can acknowledge it, and we can honor the people who experienced it. And I think whether you're coming at this as a historian or a dancer or a politician, that's really the shared goal.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm mindful that we're probably coming up to around an hour now, and if I can be really cheeky, I've got just a couple of questions maybe to sort of round things out. Is that okay?
Of course.
I'm really interested in what's been said here around language and around communicating and the adoption of movement, especially teamed with this idea of feminism and the fact that we're kind of in this fourth wave of feminism now that I think has adopted an awful lot more in the way of soft power and of genuinely kind of collectivizing our power and actually acknowledging that some of that power needs to be shared with men and with language and making feminism accessible. And I'm just wondering whether or not, in a way, actually dance is a fourth wave feminist kind of concept today, because it allows everybody to feel something, and maybe that's why movement and dance is a really impressive way of exploring genuinely deep embodied cultural and collective harm. And I just sort of wondered maybe whether either of you could speak to that.
Yeah, I will try and speak to it somewhat succinctly and hand over to Clara. I think dance absolutely is, and I might let Clara talk more about dance specifically because I'm not a dancer trained in dance, but in terms of the body and movement, I think because women's bodies have been so tightly controlled and prescribed for so long, now that there has been an opening up, should we say, of society and politics, not in a Disneyland utopian sense, but things have improved to an extent, and things may continue to improve, I hope. You know, women had to take their bodies back. We had to take control of how they moved. We had to show that we have agency over our bodies. And we've had to show how our bodies have been very much inscribed historically by power systems, what they've been subjected to. And we need to tell stories and share our experiences in ways that aren't already overly dominated by patriarchal histories. And language and the law is very much a patriarchal construct. Like, show me a woman who wrote our constitution in Ireland. Haven't met one yet, you know. And so the body, we have greater agency there, And it's also more complex. You're not working off the same binaries of good and bad, man, woman. There's a lot more focus, I think, on just being human, and the human need to move. And I think that can create an energy that even when you're dealing with something really difficult and really sensitive, it has the ability to lift everyone. So that would be my immediate response. I don't know about you, Clara.
Yes, no, my immediate response would be that dance provides me, I know personally, with that sense of control in my own body, because you, especially if you're training or you're doing a lot of dancing, you have control over your body that in a very specific way that lots of people don't, and you can feel everything you're doing. And I feel most in control of my body when I'm dancing, in a very like physical, muscular sense, but also that when it comes to choreography or creating on other dancers, that they have that control, and something I might do that I ask them to do looks very different on their body. And so you're constantly reminded that everyone's body has its own sense and its own identity, and they have their own control over how they do things. And so like in a very physical sense, again, it gives me the sense that when I'm dancing, or when people are dancing my own choreography, that we're in control of that, we're aligned, and that power has come from the people, the women before me, that give me that power to dance, and to dance the way I want to dance. And if you look back on the history of dance, even classical ballet now, it's still very anti-feminist, really. It's always about the man picking up the woman, or she looks pretty and she dies and we have to save her, all these things, the classic ballet stories. But it's becoming this new thing in dance where men and women together, it's all coming together, especially in contemporary dance, that we all are in this together and moving together as one, and we all have that control of our own bodies. And that comes with years of technique and things like that, but also that mental state that we have now, that there's no reason why men and women should dance differently, or why we can't have the same control when we move, is how I would look at it in a dance sense.
And that seems to transcend, in a sense, that transcends the gender, because actually if we're enabling everybody to feel these issues of female displacement, disembodiment, disenfranchisement, all of those things that we have disabled in ourselves. I mean, I was interested in what you were saying earlier about sort of the embodiment of memory, and how we sort of push those things down and people weren't able to speak. But actually, had they spoken, the language wasn't theirs to speak anyway. So this idea of the physicality of memory is really interesting, but that in a very contemporary sense, actually, that doesn't need to be gender specific. Actually, if I burn a man or I burn a woman, we're both still burned. Like, I think there's something in that, but actually, as a recipient witnessing those movements, we are already addressing our own identity with those actions, harms, hurts, pains, whatever they are. Does that actually give us a clarity that language can't? And will that help feminism a bit?
I think anything that helps people come together for a conversation and spend time together, no matter what the topic, no matter how bad the history, it's better to have people in the room, at the table, at the theatre, at the pub, than not. And I would hope that art, dance, movement, using the body as a way to tackle memory, to tackle suppression or oppression, can lead to those conversations that can bring us forward. That would be, for me, it just reminds me, I think, of the power of what we have and what we can do. But anything that brings people together to talk about the past, to talk about the present, that's going to shape your attitudes for decision making, for empathy, for education about the future, and that's only a good thing. And in one way, being Irish, you're part of a really small country, but you're part of an absolutely huge diaspora that can be very, very powerful. And so tapping into that to bring people together is a privilege, and it's an opportunity. And I think we all need to make the most of that, because we live in a very politicized society where a lot of the discourse is outside of our control because of how social media works.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I think especially with my piece, I don't think I was being overtly feminist. I think it just came across in that way, maybe to some people, maybe not to others, but like Miriam said, it opened the conversation and it let people have the chance to watch it, observe, maybe they take nothing away from it, that's art, or maybe they were deeply touched by it for years and years, I hope. But as long as it opens a conversation, that is the most important thing. And whether it's a conversation about Ireland, feminism, mothers, bodies, whatever that may be, I think art and dance, especially when it comes to body, has that opportunity. And I feel very fortunate that I have the opportunity to create things like that can open conversations. So hopefully it continues.
One of the things that we spoke about when we did the performance over at Tate as part of Invisible Women then was that I was really, on the 3 times that I saw the piece, I was always genuinely affected by the fact that out of these awful stories, histories, that you had shown empathy to everyone really in that story, and that actually, while the piece didn't run away from the hurt and the pain, actually it did end with messages of hope. And I think that really sets it aside as a piece, because actually, of course, these lives continued. They still had other places to go, other agendas to fulfill, other things that happened in their world that hopefully weren't nearly as painful. So I just wonder whether or not we could speak a little bit about that hope, both in terms of what you intended with that and also what you both hope for your work now. Clara, I'm going to come to you first.
Yeah, no, it's actually a wee bit of a funny story about that very last piece, because I had ended it in a very morbid way, that in my mind she unfortunately passed away and, you know, lost her baby, and it was really, really sad. And then I was speaking to my mum about it, and I was like, yeah, so gonna end like this. And my mum was like, you can't do that. You cannot do that. People will be just beside themselves. And I was like, well, some women were able to sort of transition back into the community. Some were moved on to other awful places, but some were able to transition back into communities. And even though it was very hard and they had to live with that trauma, they were somehow put back in and tried to create a lifestyle. And so that's what I ended up going with, because I couldn't let mum sit through that. And so I'm so glad I did now, as you said, because I think it brings a sense of lightness a little bit at the end, even though you can still sense that she's not ever going to completely become herself again, and that she's living with this trauma in her own self that she can't actually get out of that, and no one else around her knows, and that's the saddest thing. But I think having a little bit of hope, and even just a bit of hope for the future in general, future of Ireland, of women in Ireland, of, you know, that things just in general are going to get better. And I know it's a very sort of maybe rose-colored glasses view on life, but I felt that it was important to give people that moment of hope, and that things can go okay in the end. But for me, for the piece, I just hope that I can bring it to bigger audiences on a bigger scale. I'd love to bring it to Ireland, because we've done it in Liverpool twice, and I loved it in Liverpool. It was amazing. But I would love to bring it to Ireland and bring it to its home crowd and see how it's taken here, if people appreciate it in the same way and what the reaction is, and just to open the conversation again here, especially in the north, because I feel it's not talked about as much here. And just to give it another lease of life, I would love to add a couple more pieces in, extend the storyline a bit more and delve a little deeper into those different emotions, especially the nuns. I find that's a very interesting side of things that I haven't really looked at. But yes, I would love to just maybe even a tour. That would be the ultimate dream. But we'll see. At the moment, things are still a little difficult with the current climate. So in the next few years, that would be the ultimate goal, to get it on tour in Ireland.
And Miriam, how about you?
In terms of hope, I think the hope comes from the students and how the students engaged with the history and the material, and their own sense of it, their own personal sense of it, their own intellectual sense of it, their own artistic sense of it. When we dialogue with the Tuam Home Alliance and they look at the work the students created, they felt hope, because here is a generation about to graduate and take their place in the world, an educated generation who believe them. They believe every word of it, and they feel it's true, and they're not going to forget it. And I think that's really important. So for me, that's where the hope was. I would hope the Tuam Home Alliance would get the proper acknowledgement from the state that they deserve. I hope anyone who went into one of these institutions, who was forced into them, gets the redress they deserve. And I'm going to quote here, it was Dr. Maeva Rourke, who's just an amazing human rights lawyer, and she's an academic here in NUI Galway. She said, "Truth is the most basic form of redress, regardless of whatever else happens." And if people who went through these institutions or are connected to them feel that their truth is being acknowledged, then that is a major first step forward, which gives me hope that other redresses and forms of restitution can be addressed in the time that people have left.
So, I just want to give you an opportunity to tell people where they can find you, and particularly in relation to this work. So Clara, I'm just going to pass to you quickly to say how people can find out more about what you're doing.
At the moment, as annoying as it is, it's mostly on social media, so probably Instagram and Facebook. But
Handles?
At Clara Kerr 5, for all handles. But that's where, I know it's classic, but that's where I mostly post all of my work and what's coming up.
And Miriam, over to you.
Yes, I am the Director of Postgraduate Studies in Drama, Theatre and Performance at NUI Galway. And you're all very welcome here. And like many people, I just long for the day when COVID is fully lifted, or we're all fully vaccinated, or everything feels safe, and we can all just meet up.
So I'd just like to say thank you ever so much from Liverpool Irish Festival to Miriam over at National University of Ireland Galway, and to Clara Kerr and Glass Creative for all of their amazing work and contributions today. Obviously this is part of a day of programme for Invisible Women, and we'll have links and all sorts of things probably in the information that's below this, but do keep on looking out for your work, our work, and we hope you've enjoyed today's discussion. Thanks ever so much.